Chapter 1. Before South Carolina was South Carolina, long before the first settlers set foot on the Carolina coast, before the name South Carolina was even imagined, this land was already ancient, shaped by fire, water, and time. To understand the true beginning of South Carolina's story, we have to go back tens of thousands of years, to an era without towns or borders, where mammoths roamed and the first people hunted with sharpened stones beneath a sky untouched by artificial light. The story begins in the shadows of the last ice age. Though glaciers never reached this far south, their chilling presence still changed everything. The climate was cooler, the coastline farther out. What is now South Carolina's beach was once miles inland, and what is now dry land was then sea floor. It was here, around 13,000 years ago, that the first people arrived. Paleo-Indians, nomadic hunters, quiet masters of survival. They moved in small groups, leaving behind a little more than stone tools and spear points, including the distinctive fluted Clovis point, a technological marvel of its time. These first South Carolinians lived in a world of great beasts: giant bison, saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, and yes, mammoths. They hunted them not with guns or traps, but with teamwork, skill, and courage, knowing full well the cost of a mistake. As centuries passed and the Great Ice Age faded, the animals changed. Many of the massive species vanished. But the people remained. They adapted. From Paleo-Indians emerged the archaic peoples, who fished the rivers, gathered nuts and berries from the forests, and shaped tools not only from stone, but from bone and shell. The pace of life was still nomadic, but slower, more rooted. Camps became seasonal homes. Fire became a daily companion. Around them, the landscape transformed. Forests thickened. Rivers like the PD and the Savannah carved their way across the land. And still, the people remained. By 1000 BCE, another transformation was underway. Agriculture arrived. Maize, squash, and beans, the famous Three Sisters, began to appear in gardens. Pottery emerged in forms both useful and beautiful. And in these early ceramics, like the simple Tom's Creek or the more elaborate Deptford styles, archaeologists today can still see the fingerprints of those who shaped them by hand. These were the woodland peoples. And with their arrival came villages, burial rituals, and long-distance trade. Shell beads from the coast made their way deep into the interior, while stone from the mountains reached the shore. South Carolina was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a place to live. Then, around 1000 CE, something extraordinary happened. Across the southeast, from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast, a new culture took root. Hierarchies emerged, cities rose, ceremonial mounds pierced the horizon. This was the age of the Mississippians. And in South Carolina, they left their mark in places like the Mulberry Mound and the massive earthworks of the Savannah River Valley. These weren't simple piles of dirt. They were monuments, platforms for temples, homes for chiefs, centers of religion and power. They required labor, planning, and shared belief. Societies grew more complex. Some communities may have had thousands of residents. They fished, farmed, and fought. They played games with polished stones and buried their dead with care. The Mississippians didn't call themselves by that name. That term would come much later, invented by archaeologists. But they were real, and their lives were rich with meaning. Their leaders wore copper, a metal that traveled hundreds of miles to reach them. Their artists carved birds, serpents, and warriors into stone and shell. Their priests watched the skies, measured the seasons, and likely told stories that echoed down generations. Stories will never fully recover. And yet, just as they had risen, their world began to change. By the time Europeans first glimpsed the Carolina coast in the 1500s, many of the great mound centers were already abandoned. The reasons are still debated: drought, disease, internal conflict. But what's certain is this: the Mississippian era left behind not just ruins, but descendants. The peoples whom the Spanish and English would later encounter, the Catawba, the Cherokee, the Yamasee, the Guale, all carried pieces of that earlier world within their language, their beliefs, and their bones. Even deeper than human memory, though, South Carolina holds other stories. Stories told not in words, but in stone. Along the banks of the Edisto River and in the swamps near Somerville, fossils have been found. Shark teeth as large as a human hand, the bones of mastodons and whales, and the tracks of creatures that walked this land millions of years before any human ever drew breath. The ground itself remembers. And if you know where to look, South Carolina becomes a natural museum, a place where layers of time lie stacked upon each other like pages in a forgotten book. Before there were palmetto flags, before battles in cotton and rebellion, before any concept of state or nation, there was this: a land shaped by fire and flood, by humans and mammoths, by stone points and clay pots and sacred mounds. A land that was not waiting to be discovered, but had already lived through ages of discovery, transformation, and loss. This is the true beginning of South Carolina. Not with colonists stepping off boats, but with ancient footsteps pressed into soil long vanished, with hands shaping pottery beside rivers still flowing, with hunters standing silent in forests now swallowed by time. And so, before the palmetto, before the English, before the war cries and the patriot flags, there was only this: land, people, and the slow rhythm of history. The roots of South Carolina go far deeper than Charleston's streets or Columbia's monuments. They run into the earth itself, into stories told by firelight, into the bones beneath our feet. And that is where we begin. Chapter 2: The Spanish, the French, and the struggle to settle. When the first sails appeared on the horizon, the people of the Carolina coast had already lived there for thousands of years. Their ancestors had shaped the land, buried their dead beneath mounds, and passed down oral histories that stretched back into time's deep cradle. But now, in the mid-1500s, the world was changing. Foreign ships brought not only new goods and strange tongues, but ambition, burning, desperate ambition. In South Carolina, with its rivers, forests, and promise of untamed riches, became the target of a deadly contest. It began with Spain. In 1521, Spanish explorer Francisco Gordillo sailed along the coast of what would become South Carolina. He kidnapped several Native Americans and took them back to the Caribbean, an ominous beginning that set the tone for early encounters. A decade later, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, a Spanish nobleman, followed up with a colonization attempt. He named the area San Miguel de Gualdape, somewhere near present-day Georgetown, and tried to plant Spain's flag in the shifting sands of the New World. But things quickly unraveled. Disease, hunger, mutiny, and fierce resistance from local native groups devoured the expedition from within. The colony vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Ayllón himself died there, one of many European leaders who would not live to see their colonial dreams come true. South Carolina's coast, lush and teeming with life, looked inviting on a map. But the reality was brutal. The terrain was unfamiliar, the summers blistering, the diseases foreign and lethal. And the people who lived there, the Cofitacheki, the Guale, the Kusabo, and others, were not idle bystanders in someone else's story. They had their own politics, their own rivalries, and their own rules. When Hernando de Soto marched through the region in 1540 with dreams of gold and glory, he found complex chiefdoms that could both welcome and deceive. In Cofitacheki, he was received with gifts and ceremony, but the warmth quickly faded. De Soto took their leader, a woman known in later chronicles as the Lady of Cofitacheki, hostage. His men plundered stores of pearls, supplies, and whatever treasures they could carry. The Spanish would later claim divine right. The locals saw only betrayal. But Spain was not the only European power with eyes on the coast. In 1562, the French arrived. Not Catholic conquistadors, but Protestant Huguenots, fleeing persecution in Europe and searching for a safe haven in the Americas. Led by Jean Ribault, they sailed into Port Royal Sound and constructed a small fort, Charles Fort, named in honor of their king. It was the first French attempt to build a colony on the North American mainland, and for a brief moment, it looked like they might succeed. But the wilderness was unrelenting. Supplies ran low. Relationships with native tribes were fragile. And Ribault, rather than staying, returned to France for reinforcements, just as civil war erupted back home. The men he left behind waited in vain. When hunger set in, they built a crude boat and attempted to sail back across the Atlantic. Few survived. Charles Fort was abandoned, consumed by fire, rot, and time. Still, the French weren't finished. In 1564, they established another colony, this time further south in Florida, Fort Caroline. But Spain, now determined not to cede an inch of its claimed territory, responded swiftly. Under the ruthless Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, the Spanish attacked Fort Caroline, slaughtered most of its inhabitants, and solidified their control of the southeast. To drive the point home, Menéndez established Santa Elena on Paris Island, just miles from where Charles Fort had once stood. This would be Spain's first serious attempt to build a long-term settlement in what is now South Carolina. Santa Elena held on for over 2 decades. It became a hub of Spanish colonial life in the region, complete with farms, homes, a church, and even plans for expansion inland. For a time, it looked as if Spain might truly succeed where others had failed. But the pressures were immense. The native populations surrounding them were uneasy, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. Supplies had to come by sea, and storms were frequent. In 1576, native resistance exploded into open violence, and the Spanish were forced to evacuate. Though they returned a year later, the dream was already crumbling. By 1587, Santa Elena was abandoned for good. Spain's focus shifted south, toward the more defensible and profitable colony of St. Augustine in Florida. So why had all these attempts failed? It wasn't for lack of courage or conviction. The Europeans had come with maps, muskets, and missionaries. But they had underestimated the land and the people. The coastal tribes were not unified, but they understood the value of their territory. They formed alliances, broke them, traded when it suited them, and fought when they had to. The settlers brought disease, and the diseases spread faster than diplomacy. Every interaction was layered with misunderstanding, suspicion, and competing visions of what this land could be. South Carolina, in these early years of contact, became a graveyard of colonial ambitions. Spanish soldiers, French Huguenots, and native warriors all bled into its soil. And yet, from the ashes of each failure, new plans emerged. Maps were redrawn. Letters were sent back across the sea. Tales of golden cities and fertile coasts continued to inflame the imaginations of kings and merchants alike. They would not give up so easily. Meanwhile, native peoples adapted. Some were decimated by disease. Others grew stronger by playing the newcomers against each other. Their world had been irrevocably altered, but they were not yet conquered. They watched. They waited. And they learned. The story of first contact in South Carolina is not one of triumphant discovery, but of friction, failure, and persistence. It is a story of empires testing the limits of their power, of fragile outposts swallowed by wilderness, and of native nations who refused to disappear. The palmetto trees, which would one day become symbols of resilience, stood silent witness to this age of collision. Roots buried deep in ground that had seen more than most would ever know. And in the silence that followed Santa Elena's fall, a new power began to stir across the Atlantic. The English were watching, and soon they would come, not just to explore, but to stay. Chapter 3: Charlestown Rising. After decades of dashed ambitions and rotting forts, the European dream of settling the Carolina coast refused to die. Spain had tried and faltered. The French had come and vanished. The native peoples remained, battered but not broken. And now it was England's turn. Unlike the others, the English came not just with muskets and missionaries, but with something far more durable. A charter backed by capital, a plan shaped by profit, and settlers determined not to fail. Where others had left ruins, they would raise a city. And in 1670, they did. Charlestown, named in honor of King Charles II, was born not on the site we now call Charleston, but a few miles inland on the west bank of the Ashley River. The settlers arrived aboard ships like the Carolina, weary from the voyage but guided by the Lord's proprietors. 8 English noblemen granted sweeping authority over the province by royal decree. Their goal was simple and audacious: build a profitable colony that would rival or surpass the riches of the Caribbean. At first, it was a struggle. Swampy ground, disease-bearing mosquitoes, and uneasy relations with local native tribes, particularly the Kiowa and the Etowah, threatened to sink this latest venture into the same oblivion that had swallowed Charlesfort and Santa Elena. But unlike the scattered and desperate settlements before them, the English of Charlestown came prepared to endure. They brought enslaved Africans, livestock, seeds, and an economic model that looked southward to the booming sugar islands of Barbados. Some of the earliest settlers were Barbadian planters themselves, hardened by the brutal logic of the plantation system. They carried not just cargo, but an ideology, an understanding of how to make land produce wealth at scale. That ideology would soon define everything. Within a decade, Charlestown relocated to the peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper rivers, higher, healthier ground, with a natural harbor perfect for trade. From that vantage point, the city grew rapidly. Fortifications were raised. Wharves lined the shore. Brick houses emerged, framing a skyline that hinted at ambition. Charlestown was no longer a coastal experiment. It was the rising heart of a southern powerhouse. At the center of this new colonial economy stood 2 pillars: rice and slavery. Rice, the white gold of the Low Country, transformed swampy fields into sources of unimaginable wealth. But the knowledge of how to cultivate rice did not come from the English. It came from Africa. Enslaved men and women from the rice-growing regions of West Africa brought with them not only their labor, but their expertise, techniques of irrigation, planting, and processing that the English themselves did not possess. The marshy land of South Carolina was inhospitable to most crops. But for rice, it was perfect. And so the fields were cleared, the dikes built, and the floodgates opened. The low country began to hum with the rhythm of profit, pulsing to the beat of forced labor. Slavery in Charlestown was not incidental. It was fundamental. By the early 1700s, the city had become a key port in the transatlantic slave trade. Ships arrived regularly from West Africa and the Caribbean, carrying hundreds of human beings chained below deck. Auction blocks became a familiar sight. Families were torn apart before they even touched the soil. The brutality was not hidden. It was institutional, codified into law, defended from the pulpit, and woven into the city's architecture. Mansions rose on the backs of slaves. Churches were built with slave labor. Even the famed Battery of Charleston, the seawall and promenade that would one day become a tourist icon, stood as a symbol of wealth built upon bondage. Yet the system was not without resistance. Enslaved Africans brought with them more than skills. They carried culture, language, and spiritual traditions. From these fragments emerged the Gula people, a unique African-American culture shaped by isolation on the sea islands and along the coast. Gula stories, songs, cuisine, and beliefs survived despite centuries of oppression. They whispered of ancestors, spirits, and resilience. In the shadows of the rice fields, they planted not only crops, but memory. Meanwhile, Charlestown flourished. By the mid-18th century, it was the fourth largest city in the American colonies. Its streets bustled with merchants, artisans, and aristocrats. Taverns filled with rum and gossip. Newspapers chronicled everything from pirate attacks to runaway slaves. The elite class, the low country planters, emerged as a ruling caste. They wore powdered wigs, read European philosophy, and owned thousands of acres worked by enslaved laborers. They saw themselves not as frontiersmen, but as refined gentlemen of the Enlightenment, heirs to an empire of sugar and rice. But this aristocracy was fragile, its power built on a precarious foundation. Disease remained a constant threat. Hurricanes leveled homes and flooded crops. Slave rebellions loomed like thunder on the horizon. The most famous, known as the Stono Rebellion, would erupt in 1739 just south of the city. Dozens of enslaved people rose up, seized weapons, and marched toward Spanish Florida in search of freedom. They killed and burned as they went. And though the rebellion was eventually crushed, it sent shockwaves through the colony. In its aftermath, the ruling class doubled down on control. New slave codes were passed, even harsher than before. Still, the engine of Charlestown churned on. Trade routes stretched across the Atlantic. Indigo, used to dye textiles, became a major export, enriching planters even further. And always, behind every new crop or building or political post, stood the invisible labor of thousands who had no say in the society they were building. By the eve of the American Revolution, Charlestown had become more than a colonial capital. It was a symbol of wealth, of power, of Southern identity. Its markets teemed with goods from Europe and Africa. Its churches echoed with the sermons of Anglican ministers and the whispered prayers of enslaved mothers. Its streets reflected both elegance and cruelty. a city built with purpose, defended with pride, and haunted by the human cost of its success. This was the world the English had finally built in South Carolina. A world where profit reigned supreme, where landowners ruled like nobility, and where human lives were weighed against barrels of rice and bales of indigo. Charlestown had risen, and with it, the Low Country elite. The seeds of future conflict had already been planted, in law, in soil, in blood. But for now, the city stood tall, its steeples and rooftops gleaming in the sun, the heartbeat of a colony that had learned how to survive, how to thrive, and how to dominate. And in the years to come, it would find itself not just at the center of commerce, but at the center of a storm that would sweep across all 13 colonies and shake the very foundations of empire. Chapter 4: Rice, Indigo, and Slavery. By the early 18th century, South Carolina was no longer a fragile outpost clinging to the coast. It was becoming something else entirely, an engine of wealth for the British Empire, a colony whose prosperity was unmatched in mainland North America. But behind the elegance of Charlestown's drawing rooms and the pride of its steepled skyline lay a system of brutality so total it shaped every grain of rice and every barrel of indigo exported from its shores. This is the paradox at the heart of South Carolina's rise. Its riches and its refinement, built on unrelenting human bondage. Rice was the first pillar. In the Low Country, the rivers and tidal marshes created an environment that to English eyes seemed useless, even deadly. Mosquitoes thrived there, along with diseases that killed colonists in alarming numbers. But to the enslaved Africans brought from West Africa, these marshes were familiar. Many came from the so-called Rice Coast, regions of modern Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Gambia, where rice cultivation had been perfected over centuries. They knew how to design complex irrigation systems, how to plant, flood, and drain the fields at just the right times. Their captors did not. Without the knowledge carried across the Atlantic in chains, rice cultivation in South Carolina would likely have failed. With it, it flourished. By the 1720s, rice had become the colony's dominant export, earning it the nickname, the Rice Kingdom. Vast plantations spread along the rivers, their owners measuring wealth not in pounds sterling, but in acres of swampland and the number of enslaved workers they commanded. Indigo was the second pillar. Introduced as an export crop in the 1740s, indigo produced a deep blue dye prized by the British textile industry. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, the young daughter of a plantation owner, played a key role in refining and promoting the crop. By mid-century, South Carolina exported hundreds of thousands of pounds of indigo annually, its profits underwriting the elegant lives of the planter elite. But like rice, indigo's wealth depended entirely on enslaved labor. The plant's processing was grueling and dangerous, requiring workers to wade through vats of fermenting indigo that stained their skin and sickened their lungs. Yet the dye fetched high prices abroad, and so the fields expanded. Together, rice and indigo transformed South Carolina into one of the richest colonies in North America. The planters of the Low Country built grand houses in Charlestown, decorated their parlors with imported china and silver, and sent their sons to be educated in England. They saw themselves as an aristocracy, the southern counterpart to Britain's landed gentry. But their wealth rested on a foundation of violence and control. Enslaved Africans outnumbered whites in South Carolina by the early 18th century, creating a society in which fear and coercion were woven into daily life. the colony responded with some of the harshest slave codes in the Americas. Laws that stripped enslaved people of any legal personhood, restricted movement, forbade assembly, and prescribed brutal punishments for defiance. Yet even in the shadow of this oppression, a distinct culture emerged. On the sea islands and in the more isolated coastal plantations, enslaved Africans preserved and blended their languages, beliefs, and customs into what became known as Gula. The Gula language retained West African rhythms and words, creating a Creole that allowed communication across different African ethnic groups. Spirituals carried hidden messages. Folk tales of Brer Rabbit and other trickster figures gave shape to a moral universe in which wit and endurance could outsmart power. Foodways, okra stews, rice dishes like red rice and perlou, kept African flavors alive even under the watch of overseers. In the evenings, after the day's forced labor ended, stories, songs, and crafts passed from elders to children, a quiet resistance that no slave code could entirely erase. But resistance also erupted openly. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies before the Revolution. A group of enslaved men, many of them from Angola and trained in warfare, gathered near the Stono River, seized weapons from a store, and began marching toward Spanish Florida, which promised freedom to fugitives from British colonies. They burned plantations and killed more than 20 whites before being confronted by militia. The rebellion was suppressed with deadly force. Dozens of the rebels were killed in battle or executed afterward. In response, the colonial government passed even stricter laws, including the 1740 Negro Act, which further limited education, movement, and assembly for enslaved people. Yet the rebellion sent a lasting tremor through South Carolina's ruling class, a reminder that their system rested on the constant threat of revolt. The harshness of plantation life was not only physical, but psychological. Families were routinely separated at sale. Punishments included whipping, branding, mutilation, and death. Disease stalked the rice fields, where standing water bred malaria and dysentery. Life expectancy for an enslaved person on a rice plantation was far lower than for a field hand in Virginia or Pennsylvania. Planters calculated this loss into their business model, treating human lives as expendable assets. Overseers kept productivity high with a mix of terror and quotas, while planters themselves retreated to townhouses in Charlestown during the summer, sickly season, leaving their estates under the control of hired managers. Even as this cruelty deepened, the wealth of South Carolina soared. By the eve of the American Revolution, the colony exported more rice than all other colonies combined, and indigo profits filled British coffers. Insurance companies in London underwrote slave ships and plantations alike. South Carolina's elite occupied seats of political power, shaping colonial policy to protect their interests. They lobbied for tariffs, subsidies, and military support against Native Americans and Maroons, communities of escaped slaves hiding in the swamps. The entire society became a machine designed to extract maximum profit from land and labor, and to defend itself against the very people it exploited. Yet the humanity of the enslaved persisted. In secret prayer meetings, in the intricate patterns of sweetgrass baskets, in songs that blended Christian hymns with African rhythms, they carved out spaces of dignity. Some ran away to the interior, joining native communities or forming hidden settlements. Others engaged in subtle sabotage, breaking tools, feigning illness, slowing work. Every act of survival was, in its way, an act of defiance. As the 18th century wore on, the contradictions of South Carolina grew sharper. On the one hand stood the image of refinement, opera performances in Charlestown, scientific societies, elegant gardens modeled on those of Europe. On the other hand lay the fields, the chains, the auction blocks. The wealth of the few was inseparable from the suffering of the many. And this was not a secret. Visitors from Europe noted the imbalance with unease. Some called the colony a slave society, not merely a society with slaves, but one whose every institution, law, and habit revolved around maintaining slavery as its core. This was the South Carolina that emerged from its first century under English rule. A land transformed by rice and indigo, ruled by an elite who measured themselves against European nobility, and sustained by a system of human bondage whose cruelty would echo through generations. In the Sea Islands, the Gullah people continued to nurture a culture of memory and endurance. In the plantation houses, planters counted their profits and tightened their laws. Between them lay a chasm of power and pain. And yet, as this system matured, seeds of its eventual upheaval were also being sown. The same networks that carried rice and indigo across the Atlantic also carried ideas of liberty, rebellion, and rights that would soon set the colonies ablaze. For now, though, South Carolina stood as both a marvel and a warning, a place where the engine of wealth and suffering turned ceaselessly, driving the colony toward a future it could not yet see but had already begun to shape. Chapter 5: Rebellion and Revolution. By the mid-18th century, South Carolina was among the wealthiest of Britain's 13 American colonies. Its rice plantations fed the empire. Its indigo exports dyed the fabrics of London's elite. Its merchant class in Charlestown grew ever richer, their ships crowding the harbor, their sons educated in England, their homes filled with imported luxuries. On the surface, loyalty to the crown ran deep. But just beneath that polished facade, discontent smoldered. And when revolution came, it would rip through South Carolina with a fury that left no region untouched and no allegiance unquestioned. The first sparks came not from muskets, but from paper. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a tax on printed materials meant to help cover the costs of the French and Indian War. To London, it seemed reasonable. To the colonists, it was a line crossed. In Charlestown, protests erupted. Merchants boycotted British goods. Effigies of tax collectors were hung and burned. A group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty gathered beneath the shade of a live oak tree, soon to be known as the Liberty Tree, and pledged resistance. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and in South Carolina's streets they began to grow. Over the next decade, tensions escalated. The Town's Hand Acts, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts. One by one, Parliament's decisions pushed colonists further from loyalty and closer to defiance. South Carolinians joined in protests, smuggled banned goods, and sent delegates to the Continental Congress. Yet the colony remained deeply divided. While planters in the Low Country leaned toward rebellion, motivated in part by economic self-interest and a desire for political autonomy, many settlers in the upcountry and backwoods remained loyal to the crown. For them, the British king offered order, tradition, and protection from frontier chaos. As rebellion turned to revolution, South Carolina became a battlefield not just in a war for independence, but in a civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor. When fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the colony sprang into action. Militias formed. Ammunition was stockpiled. In Charlestown, Patriots seized the armory and forced the royal governor to flee. A provincial congress was established to govern in the king's absence, and by March 1776, South Carolina had written its own constitution and declared itself a free and independent state. Months before the Declaration of Independence would be signed in Philadelphia. War soon came to its shores. In June 1776, a British fleet sailed into Charleston Harbor, seeking to crush the rebellion early. The target was Fort Sullivan, a hastily constructed palmetto log fort on Sullivan's Island, commanded by Colonel William Moultrie. The British believed it would fall within hours, but the soft palmetto wood absorbed the cannonballs like a sponge, while Moultrie's men returned fire with deadly precision. The British withdrew in humiliation, and the fort, later renamed Fort Moultrie, became a symbol of South Carolina's defiance. The palmetto tree itself would eventually be enshrined on the state flag, its flexible strength a fitting emblem for a people now bent but not broken. But the early glory of Sullivan's Island gave way to years of grim and grinding conflict. In 1780, the war turned against the Patriots. The British returned to South Carolina with a vengeance, and this time they did not fail. In May, Charleston fell after a long siege, the largest American surrender of the war. Over 5,000 troops were captured, and British General Sir Henry Clinton declared the colony pacified. But South Carolina would prove anything but quiet. With the fall of Charleston, the fight moved inland, where guerrilla warfare erupted across the countryside. British troops and Loyalist militias clashed with rebel partisans in a brutal neighbor-against-neighbor conflict that spared no one. Plantations were burned, families were torn apart, churches were used as barracks, no battle lines were fixed, and no rules were followed. It was a war without mercy. Into this chaos stepped a man who would become legend, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. A veteran of earlier conflicts with the Cherokee, Marion commanded a small band of irregular fighters who harassed British supply lines, ambushed patrols, and melted into the swamps before they could be caught. He led from the front, rode hard through treacherous terrain, and refused to give up even when the odds were hopeless. His tactics frustrated British commanders, who branded him a coward and a criminal. But to his men, and to the people of South Carolina, he became a symbol of resilience. In a war where traditional armies often failed, Marion's ragged partisans kept the flame of rebellion alive. Other fighters followed his lead. Thomas Sumter, known as the Gamecock, waged his own savage campaign in the upcountry. Andrew Pickens, the Wizard Owl, struck with quiet precision. These men were not polished generals. They were farmers, merchants, and hunters turned warriors, driven by a mix of patriotism, revenge, and necessity. Together, they turned South Carolina's wilderness into a battlefield no army could tame. The bloodshed reached every corner of the state. In the backcountry, the conflict was especially personal. Old feuds reignited. Accusations of loyalty or treason led to executions. Women were assaulted. Crops were destroyed. At times, the revolution resembled a feud more than a war, with shifting alliances and savage reprisals. It was not just the British who brought violence. Patriot and Loyalist militias often matched each other in cruelty, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. Yet amid the horror, momentum shifted. Battles like Kings Mountain in 1780 and Cowpens in 1781 proved turning points. At Kings Mountain, Patriot militias annihilated a Loyalist force on the North Carolina border, killing their leader, Major Patrick Ferguson. At Cowpens, General Daniel Morgan outmaneuvered the feared British commander Banastre Tarleton, inflicting a stunning defeat. These victories, won largely by South Carolina fighters, helped turn the tide of the war in the South and set the stage for the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. By the war's end, South Carolina lay in ruins. Its economy was shattered, its plantations burned, its population divided. Charleston had suffered occupation, the upcountry had endured civil war, and thousands of enslaved people had taken advantage of the chaos to escape or were taken by the British to other colonies. For those who had survived, the victory was bittersweet. Independence had been won, but at a staggering cost. South Carolina emerged from the Revolution not just as a free state, but as a transformed one. The experience of rebellion had hardened its people and deepened their sense of identity. Heroes like Marion and Moultrie were immortalized in story and stone. But so too were the wounds, the divisions between coast and backcountry, or rich and poor, patriot and loyalist. The Revolution had not healed South Carolina. It had exposed its deepest contradictions. Yet the story did not end there. In the ashes of war, a new republic was rising. And South Carolina, for better or worse, would be at the center of its next great chapter. Chapter 6. A New State in a New Nation. The guns fell silent, but the land was far from peaceful. South Carolina had helped win a war for independence, but now it faced a new challenge: building a future in a republic that had never existed before. The British were gone. The king was no longer sovereign. What remained was a battered countryside, a devastated economy, and a divided people trying to forge unity from rebellion. South Carolina, though proud of its revolutionary legacy, stepped into the American experiment with equal parts confidence and conflict. In 1788, South Carolina became the 8th state to ratify the United States Constitution. Its delegates played a crucial role in shaping the very structure of the federal government. Charles Pinckney, a young but shrewd politician from a powerful low-country family, pushed hard for a strong central government that would protect property rights, especially slaveholding interests. At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, South Carolina's voice was clear and unapologetic. The new nation must accommodate and protect slavery if it expected the support of the Southern states. In the final document, that bargain was struck, quietly, indirectly, but unmistakably. The 3/5 clause, the continuation of the transatlantic slave trade for another 20 years, and the return of fugitive slaves were all woven into the Constitution's DNA. South Carolina had helped shape the new nation, and in doing so, ensured that its plantation economy would remain untouched by Northern interference. In the years that followed, South Carolina's political power grew quickly. Its elite class, anchored in Charleston and spread across sprawling plantations, dominated state government and sent its sons to Congress. Figures like John Rutledge, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and Pierce Butler became national statesmen, their names etched into the founding documents of the Republic. Yet beneath the appearance of unity, deep regional tensions festered. The Low Country, with its wealth and coastal connections, ruled the political landscape. But the Upcountry, home to smaller farms, veterans of the Revolution, and far fewer enslaved people, resented being left behind. Still, what truly changed the fate of South Carolina in the early Republic wasn't law or ideology. It was a plant: cotton. For decades, South Carolina's economy had depended on rice and indigo, both lucrative but limited in scope. Rice required specific land and labor systems, and indigo's profitability waned after the Revolution. But in the 1790s, a new variety of cotton, short staple cotton, combined with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin to create a revolution of a different kind. Cotton could grow inland, beyond the swampy low country, into the rolling hills and fertile valleys of the upcountry. And now, it could be processed quickly, cleaned of its sticky seeds in a matter of hours rather than days. Almost overnight, cotton became king. South Carolina embraced this new monarch with fervor. Cotton plantations sprang up across the state, pushing westward and deepening the institution of slavery in areas that had once been marginal to it. The upcountry, once skeptical of the planter elite, now had a path to join them. Small farmers bought enslaved people and expanded their land holdings. Slave auctions became more frequent. The domestic slave trade boomed. Cotton poured out of Charleston's ports by the ton. Land that had once seemed isolated and impoverished now pulsed with profit. But with this newfound prosperity came entrenchment. The economic dependence on slavery became absolute. By the early 1800s, enslaved African Americans made up a majority of South Carolina's population. On the plantations, they toiled from dawn to dusk under the lash of overseers, planting and picking cotton, clearing land, repairing tools, raising children born into bondage. Their labor fueled the South's wealth, and their lack of freedom became the price the white elite was willing to defend at any cost. As the cotton economy surged, so too did South Carolina's political weight. The state became a voice of Southern pride and conservatism. In national debates, its leaders consistently pushed for policies that protected their economic interests. Low tariffs, expansion into Western lands, and above all, the preservation of slavery. But not all South Carolinians agreed. In the cities, a growing number of artisans, free black people, and poor whites questioned the power of the plantation elite. In the hills, resentment simmered over unequal representation and taxation. The state legislature remained firmly in the grip of Charleston's oligarchy, but opposition was growing. The contradictions of the young republic were nowhere more visible than in South Carolina. It had helped birth a nation founded on liberty, while denying liberty to more than half its own population. It had produced intellectuals and politicians who championed democracy, while enforcing a rigid hierarchy of race and class. And it had emerged from a war for freedom only to double down on bondage. Still, the early republic was a time of ambition. New roads were built. Towns sprang up inland. Columbia was established as the new state capital in 1786, a symbolic gesture to bridge the geographic and political divide between coast and interior. Schools were founded, newspapers multiplied, trade expanded. Charleston remained the cultural center, but other towns, Camden, Georgetown, Spartanburg, began to assert themselves. In the rural areas, white settlers pushed deeper into Cherokee land, often in violation of treaties. Tensions flared, and the federal government sent agents to negotiate peace while quietly supporting expansion. For enslaved people, freedom remained a distant dream, but cultural resistance endured. African traditions blended with Christian belief. Secret gatherings kept music, stories, and language alive. Despite the constant threat of punishment, rebellion lived on in whispered prayers and daring escapes. By the turn of the 19th century, South Carolina stood tall among the states of the new nation. Its wealth, political influence, and aristocratic class made it a symbol of Southern pride. But that pride carried within it the seeds of future conflict. The deeper it sank into cotton and slavery, the more its future would be tied to a system that the rest of the world was slowly beginning to question. For now, the fields were green, the markets full, and the republic young. But the choices made in these years, who would have power, who would be free, and who would be silenced, would shape not only the destiny of South Carolina, but the destiny of a nation still learning what it truly meant to be free. Chapter 7: The Fire Eaters and the Road to Secession. By the middle of the 19th century, South Carolina had become more than just a prosperous southern state. It was a fortress of political ideology, a place where the belief in slavery was not merely defended, but glorified, where honor was measured in resistance to federal power, and where the whisper of disunion became a rallying cry. The seeds of secession were planted not in the heat of war, but in the careful, calculated rhetoric of men who believed compromise was betrayal. These men came to be known as the Fire Eaters, and South Carolina was their furnace. It had not always been this way. In the early years of the American Republic, South Carolina had been a proud architect of the Constitution. But as the decades wore on, the federal government grew stronger, tariffs were imposed, and the political center of gravity tilted toward the industrial North. In South Carolina's eyes, Washington no longer protected Southern interests, it threatened them. The tension boiled over in the 1820s and 1830s with a crisis that tested the very fabric of the Union: the nullification crisis. At the heart of the conflict was a tariff. The federal government had imposed duties on imported goods to protect northern manufacturers. South Carolina, with its export-heavy economy and reliance on foreign goods, saw this as an economic attack. Led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian and one of the most influential political theorists of the age, the state declared that it had the right to nullify federal laws it deemed unconstitutional. The idea was radical, that a single state could opt out of federal authority. It was also a warning shot. In 1832, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, and the stage was set for a showdown with President Andrew Jackson. Jackson, himself a Southerner, responded with fury. He denounced nullification as treason and prepared to send federal troops. War hung in the air. Only a last-minute compromise, a reduced tariff backed by Henry Clay, diffused the crisis. But the damage was done. South Carolina had asserted its defiant creed, that states had rights beyond the Constitution, and that resistance to federal overreach was a matter of principle, not rebellion. It was a doctrine that would linger like smoke over every political debate that followed. As the 1840s and 1850s unfolded, the national conversation shifted increasingly toward slavery. The abolitionist movement gained ground in the North. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the rise of the Free Soil movement intensified the moral pressure. Every new state added to the Union became a battleground over whether it would be free or slave. And South Carolina watched with growing paranoia. The planter elite, who saw slavery as the backbone of their economy and culture, believed their way of life was under siege. And they weren't wrong. Into this atmosphere stepped a new generation of hardliners, the Fire Eaters. They were politicians, editors, and preachers who rejected compromise and preached the gospel of secession. Robert Barnwell Rhett, the most famous among them, openly called for the South to break away from the Union long before Lincoln's name was ever known. To Rhett and his followers, slavery wasn't just defensible. It was a moral good, a civilizing force. They railed against Northern aggression, against federal intrusion, and against the very idea that liberty could exist in a country that questioned the rights of slaveholders. Their language was incendiary. They spoke of honor, of blood, of ancient rights and divine sanction. They wrapped their cause in the American flag while declaring that the Union was already broken in spirit. South Carolina newspapers fanned the flames, turning every national debate into an existential crisis. When the Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state and gave the North more political weight, South Carolina nearly seceded on the spot. Only hesitation from neighboring states held it back. But the fire had caught, and it would not be extinguished. The final spark came in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Though Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, he also opposed its expansion into new territories. That, for South Carolina's leaders, was intolerable. To them, containment meant eventual extinction, and extinction meant ruin. On December 20th, 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's victory, South Carolina's legislature met in Charleston and voted unanimously to secede from the United States. Church bells rang. Cannons fired. Crowds cheered in the streets. The Ordinance of Secession was adopted and signed with solemn ceremony. In its accompanying declaration, the state laid out its grievances, not only about tariffs or federal power, but explicitly about slavery. The North, it claimed, had become hostile to the institution and to the Southern way of life. Therefore, South Carolina would dissolve its bonds with the Union as a sovereign state reclaiming its independence. It was the first, and that mattered. South Carolina had always viewed itself as a leader among the Southern states, a guardian of tradition and purity. In choosing to secede first, it set the tone for what would follow. Within months, 6 other states joined it. Together, they would form the Confederate States of America. But South Carolina had lit the match. The question of why here, why first, is not hard to answer. Nowhere else in the South had the planter class so thoroughly dominated political life. Nowhere else was the population of enslaved people so high relative to whites. Nowhere else had the doctrine of states' rights and nullification been so loudly and consistently championed. South Carolina's leaders believed they had more to lose than any other state, and more to gain by breaking away. Their entire economy, social structure, and worldview depended on the preservation of slavery. To compromise was to surrender. To secede was to survive. But what they could not foresee was the scale of the storm they had unleashed. The celebrations in Charleston masked a terrible truth, that secession would not lead to peace, but to the bloodiest war in American history. The cannons that roared in triumph would soon fire in anger at Fort Sumter, just off Charleston's coast, marking the official start of the Civil War. And in that war, South Carolina would bear both the pride of the cause it helped lead and the weight of the devastation it could not escape. The fire eaters had won the argument, but at a price no one yet understood. The road to secession was paved with rhetoric, principle, and fear, but where it led was ruin. Still, in 1860, they stood defiant, believing history would vindicate them, and that their state had taken the first noble step toward a new Southern nation. Time, however, would tell a different story. Chapter 8: The Civil War and Total Destruction. It began where it would soon come full circle, at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the very state that had declared itself the tip of the Southern spear the first to break from the Union, would also serve as the spark that ignited the most devastating war in American history. On April 12, 1861, as the early morning light broke over the Atlantic, Confederate cannons opened fire on the Federal garrison stationed in the fort. For 34 hours, smoke filled the sky and cannonballs rained over Charleston Harbor. When the guns finally fell silent and the Union forces surrendered, the war that had been warned, delayed, and feared for decades had finally begun. South Carolina rejoiced. Church bells rang and crowds cheered, convinced they had struck the first blow in a righteous cause. The Confederate flag was raised with pride. Yet in that moment of celebration, no one could imagine the scale of the destruction that would follow. What had started as a gesture of defiance would end with fields burned, cities in ruins, and a social order reduced to ash. At first, the war seemed far from South Carolina's plantations and pine forests. Battles were fought in Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. The elite in Charleston remained confident that the war would be short, their independence secure. Enslaved people continued to toil in the cotton fields. Cotton, they believed, was still king, and European nations would never let it perish. But the world was changing faster than the planters could see. The Union Navy imposed a blockade on southern ports, choking off trade. Union troops captured Port Royal Sound in 1861, establishing a foothold on the South Carolina coast that would grow into a staging ground for deeper incursions. The war was coming home. Inside the state, tensions began to simmer. While planters and politicians preached unity, many poor whites and upcountry families questioned what exactly they were fighting for. The Confederacy promised liberty, but it demanded sacrifice of sons, food, and labor. Class resentments deepened. Enslaved people, hearing distant echoes of freedom, began to resist more boldly. Some fled to Union lines, others slowed their work, sabotaged tools, or spread rumors. The plantation world that had once seemed eternal was now trembling. And then came Sherman. By late 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman had laid waste to Georgia in his infamous March to the Sea. His army cut a swath through the Confederacy, burning crops, twisting railroad tracks, and destroying anything of military or economic value. But his campaign did not end at Savannah. It turned north, toward the very heart of rebellion. Sherman's target was South Carolina, the state that had started it all. Sherman made no attempt to hide his disdain for South Carolina. In his letters, he blamed the state for dragging the nation into war, and he promised its people a punishment to match their guilt. His troops, battle-hardened and weary, entered South Carolina in early 1865 with a fury that went beyond strategy. They burned homes, looted plantations, and left behind scorched earth. Towns like Orangeburg and Winnsboro were ravaged. Roads were destroyed. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Fields that had once produced endless rows of cotton now smoldered in smoke and silence. The true hammer blow fell on Columbia, the state capital. Sherman's army entered the city on February 17, 1865. What happened next would become a source of bitter dispute and lasting memory. Fires broke out across the city, consuming homes, churches, and public buildings. Whether the flames were set by retreating Confederates, drunken Union soldiers, or chance is still debated. But the result was total. 2/3 of Columbia was reduced to ash. The elegant city that had once symbolized the ambition of the antebellum South now lay in ruins, its streets lined with smoking chimneys and collapsed roofs. In Charleston, the cradle of secession, destruction came differently, but no less thoroughly. After years under siege by Union forces, the city was finally evacuated in February 1865. The Confederate defenders fled. Black Union troops marched in as liberators. The great port was silent. Churches had been hit by shells, homes left vacant, and the once proud waterfront turned to rubble. Slavery was collapsing before their eyes. The men and women who had once been sold in Charleston's markets now walked its streets free, confused, cautious, and hopeful. South Carolina, the birthplace of disunion, had become its graveyard. Nearly 20,000 South Carolinians died in the war. Countless others returned maimed or broken. The plantation economy, once the source of staggering wealth, was obliterated. Nearly 500,000 formerly enslaved people emerged into freedom with no land, no money, and no formal rights. The elite who had championed secession were now ruined, politically, financially, and morally. The war had done more than destroy buildings and fields. It had shattered a worldview. And yet, in the ruins, something new struggled to be born. Union troops stayed behind to occupy and rebuild. Freedmen's Bureau agents tried to organize schools, distribute food, and broker labor contracts. Northern missionaries arrived to teach and preach. Black South Carolinians formed churches, started newspapers, and sought to reunite families torn apart by decades of bondage. They were free now. But freedom, as they would soon learn, did not mean equality. The scars of war were everywhere. The palmetto trees still stood, but the pride they once symbolized now seemed fragile. Charleston's churches held empty pews. Columbia's burned-out streets echoed with silence. The South Carolina flag still flew, but over a people who were dazed, divided, and uncertain. The Civil War had been fought in many places, but for South Carolina, it had been both birthplace and battlefield. It began with fire at Fort Sumter and ended in fire at Columbia. The state that had led the charge toward secession paid the steepest price. Its economy destroyed, its cities burned, its people humbled. What lay ahead was unknown. Reconstruction would bring new battles, political, racial, and economic. The dream of a Southern nation was dead. The question now was whether South Carolina could become part of a new American nation, or whether it would spend the next generation fighting to restore the one it had lost. For now, though, the war was over. The cannons were silent. The flags were lowered. And South Carolina stood in the ruins of the storm it had helped unleash, staring into the uncertain dawn of what came next. Chapter 9. A New South or a Lost Cause. The war had ended, but peace did not arrive. South Carolina, beaten and burned, staggered into Reconstruction with no clear path forward. The enslaved had been freed, the Confederacy destroyed, but nothing had yet replaced the old order. Cities lay in rubble, plantations were overgrown, and an entire social structure had collapsed. For the first time in its history, South Carolina stood at a crossroads, not just between defeat and recovery, but between transformation and regression. What emerged in the years after 1865 would be a battle for the soul of the state. One fought not with muskets, but with votes, laws, intimidation, and the threat of resurrection. Into this shattered landscape came the freedmen. Nearly 500,000 black South Carolinians, once enslaved, were now legally free. They walked out of fields, off plantations, and away from auction blocks. Families that had been torn apart tried desperately to find one another again. Some wandered in search of lost loved ones. Others stayed near the land they had worked for generations, hoping that freedom would mean ownership. They built schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. Education became a rallying cry. Literacy, long denied to the enslaved, was now pursued with urgency and hope. The federal government attempted to guide the transition. Troops remained stationed throughout the South to enforce the terms of surrender and protect the rights of freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau, created by Congress in 1865, established schools, distributed food, mediated labor contracts, and tried to bring order to the chaos. For a brief moment, it seemed that South Carolina might become a laboratory for a more just society. But freedom, on paper, proved fragile in practice. Former Confederates, stripped of power and bitter in defeat, watched with growing alarm as formerly enslaved people voted, spoke, and held office. Black men, many of them literate, landless, and recently emancipated, were elected to state legislatures, to Congress, and to local offices. They rewrote South Carolina's Constitution in 1868, creating one of the most progressive documents of the 19th century. It guaranteed universal male suffrage, free public education, and equal access to public accommodations. For the first time in the state's history, democracy reached beyond the planter class. But every step forward was met with resistance. White supremacists refused to accept the new order. They formed secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan, which quickly spread across South Carolina, especially in the upcountry. In the darkness of night, they terrorized freed people and white allies alike, burning homes, attacking black schools, and lynching community leaders. Their goal was not only racial intimidation, but political suppression. Voter suppression through violence became a central tactic in the white Southern counterattack. Meanwhile, Northern support for Reconstruction began to waver. The federal government faced scandals, economic depression, and growing fatigue. Many white Northerners, though initially supportive of Reconstruction, lost interest in the South's problems and looked for national reconciliation instead of justice. As the 1870s wore on, the will to enforce civil rights eroded in Washington, just as the determination to undo them hardened in South Carolina. The backlash intensified. Conservative white Democrats, calling themselves redeemers, organized to reclaim power. They ran on platforms of home rule, promising to end corruption and restore order. But their true aim was to dismantle black political power and reassert white dominance. In 1876, the battle reached a fever pitch. The gubernatorial election between Democrat Wade Hampton and Republican Daniel Henry Chamberlain became a violent, chaotic referendum on Reconstruction itself. The campaign season was soaked in blood. Paramilitary groups like the Red Shirts openly marched through black communities, intimidating voters and breaking up Republican meetings. In places like Hamburg and Ellenton, armed clashes left scores dead. The ballot box became a battleground, and Election Day brought violence and fraud on an industrial scale. Both candidates claimed victory. Both inaugurated themselves as governor. Federal troops guarded the State House. For months, South Carolina stood on the edge of another civil war. Then, in 1877, came the final blow. The disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was settled by the so-called Compromise of 1877. In exchange for conceding the presidency to Hayes, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. Reconstruction, effectively, was over. With the soldiers gone, white Democrats seized full control of South Carolina's government. Black legislators were removed from office. Progressive laws were rolled back. Funding for black schools was slashed. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery, but kept many black families locked in cycles of debt and poverty. The promise of land, equality, and protection vanished like smoke. The New South that had briefly flickered into existence was buried beneath the triumphant return of the old. What followed was the cementing of the lost cause narrative, a mythology that recast the Civil War as a noble fight for Southern heritage, not a brutal defense of slavery. Former Confederates were celebrated as honorable patriots. Monuments went up. History was rewritten. The cause of secession was buried under platitudes of honor, while the realities of slavery and black resistance were erased from public memory. And yet, something had changed. Reconstruction had not been a total failure. It had proven, however briefly, that a multiracial democracy was possible in the South. Black South Carolinians had built institutions, passed laws, and served their communities with dignity and vision. Their legacy did not vanish. It went underground, into families, churches, and oral history. It became the seedbed for future movements, from civil rights to modern activism. South Carolina emerged from Reconstruction politically redeemed but morally wounded. The state had clawed its way back into white control, but only through violence, fraud, and betrayal of the very ideals on which the nation had been founded. The cost was immense. Generations of black South Carolinians would live under Jim Crow laws designed to deny them the rights their ancestors had briefly held. For decades, the wounds of war and Reconstruction would fester, hidden under the surface, but never fully healed. In the end, the question that haunted the era remained unanswered. Had South Carolina been given a chance to build a new society and refused it? Or had that chance been taken from it by those who feared what true equality might bring? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between. Reconstruction was both a dream and a battlefield, a test that revealed how far a society could go and how far it was willing to fall back. South Carolina's road through Reconstruction had been marked by courage and cowardice, by vision and violence. The war was over, but the battle for justice was far from finished. Chapter 10: Jim Crow and the Age of Disenfranchisement. The war was over. Reconstruction had ended. But for South Carolina's black citizens, the promise of freedom was rapidly dissolving into something else entirely. An era not defined by slavery, but by segregation, not by chains, but by laws, not by auction blocks, but by ballots denied. The years that followed the fall of Reconstruction marked not a healing of the nation's wounds, but the deliberate hardening of a new racial order. The state that had led the South into secession now led it into something more insidious, the age of Jim Crow. The shift came quietly at first. After federal troops withdrew in 1877, the white Democratic elite wasted no time in dismantling the gains black South Carolinians had made during Reconstruction. Black officials were removed from office. New laws were passed to reassert white control. Violence was always present: lynchings, beatings, threats. But it was the law that finished the job. A legal caste system emerged, enforced not only with clubs and guns, but with ink and legislation. In 1895, South Carolina rewrote its state constitution. Under the guise of reform and modernization, its true purpose was clear: to disenfranchise black voters without openly defying the 15th Amendment. Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, and residency requirements were all crafted with precision. White registrars, acting as gatekeepers, ensured that the hurdles were applied selectively. If you were black, you were far more likely to be deemed illiterate, uninformed, or unqualified. And if you managed to clear all the bureaucratic traps, Your name might simply not be added to the rolls at all. The results were devastating. Tens of thousands of black voters disappeared from the electorate almost overnight. Communities that had once elected their own representatives now had no voice. The power that had briefly flickered during Reconstruction was extinguished. South Carolina became, in effect, a one-party state. White supremacy was not just a cultural attitude, it was institutionalized governance. This system was upheld by force as much as by law. Lynchings became a public ritual of terror. Between the 1880s and 1930s, South Carolina saw hundreds of African Americans lynched by mobs, often with the tacit approval of local authorities. These killings were not random acts of violence. They were targeted messages. Keep your place, stay silent, do not challenge the order of things. Some victims were accused of crimes, others of disrespect, still others of success that threatened white dominance. Rarely were the killers prosecuted. Communities gathered to watch. Newspapers sometimes printed the time and location in advance. These were not just murders. They were statements of control. The Jim Crow system extended into every corner of daily life. Schools were segregated, with black children receiving secondhand books, crumbling classrooms, and fewer teachers. Trains and streetcars had separate sections, with black passengers crammed into the back. Water fountains, restrooms, hospitals, waiting rooms, even cemeteries were divided by race. The message was unmistakable. White and black were not merely different. They were unequal by design, and that inequality would be enforced from cradle to grave. Black South Carolinians resisted in ways both quiet and bold. Churches became centers of community and resistance. Ministers preached dignity and survival. Schools, often built and staffed by black communities themselves, tried to equip children for a world stacked against them. Mutual aid societies provided support where the government would not. Newspapers like the Southern Indicator gave voice to the silenced. Families passed down stories of hope, strength, and struggle. But always, the cost of open defiance was high. At the same time, a powerful myth was taking hold: the lost cause. It romanticized the Confederacy not as a rebellion to preserve slavery, but as a noble fight for states' rights and Southern honor. In this retelling, slavery was downplayed or reimagined as benign. The Reconstruction era was painted as a time of chaos and misrule, with corrupt black officials and carpetbagging Northerners ruining the South. Confederate generals were elevated to near sainthood, their statues erected in city squares and courthouse lawns. School children were taught that the Old South had been genteel and righteous, and that its fall was a tragedy rather than a moral reckoning. In South Carolina, this mythology shaped everything. Textbooks rewrote history. Confederate Memorial Day became a sacred holiday. Monuments to secessionist leaders and generals dotted the landscape. The Palmetto State wrapped itself in symbols of a past it refused to confront honestly. The lost cause was more than nostalgia. Thus, it was propaganda, reinforcing white supremacy under the guise of heritage. Life under Jim Crow was not simply about public signs or voting booths. It was about fear. It was about being watched, always. About knowing that the wrong word, the wrong tone, the wrong success could provoke ruin. It was about limited futures. Black farmers were pushed into sharecropping arrangements that left them in endless debt. Black professionals were blocked from licensing boards, universities, and associations. Trains to opportunity were rerouted, and ladders were removed altogether. And yet, amidst it all, people lived. They married. They raised children. They created music, stories, churches, and beauty. They resisted by surviving. Meanwhile, the white South Carolinian elite celebrated their control. The Democratic Party ruled uncontested. The state's economy remained largely agricultural, its industries slow to modernize. But the hierarchy held firm. At every level of society, race dictated rank. And that system, once enforced by law, became a reflex, embedded in language, culture, expectations. It taught generation after generation that race was destiny and that South Carolina's social order was immutable. But history has a long memory. Beneath the weight of Jim Crow, seeds of change were quietly taking root. Children educated in underfunded schools would one day become leaders. Families forced to whisper resistance would one day shout it. Though the system seemed invincible, it carried within it the rot of injustice. The road to equality would be long, and in South Carolina, it would be longer than in many places. But the stories of struggle, of survival, of resistance against impossible odds would not disappear. They would smolder until the next fire was lit. The age of disenfranchisement did not come with a single moment of collapse. It arrived slowly, deliberately, brick by brick, law by law. But once in place, it stood for decades. Jim Crow's South Carolina was not just a chapter of history, it was a design. One meant to erase black power, to control black lives, and to ensure that the past remained unchallenged. For a time, it succeeded, but not forever. The cracks would come, the voices would rise, and history, long manipulated, would begin to be reclaimed. But first, it had to be endured. Chapter 11. Textiles, tobacco, and the new Southern economy. The South that emerged from the ashes of war and the grip of Reconstruction was not the same South that had once built its wealth on sprawling plantations and enslaved labor. In South Carolina, the collapse of the old order left a vacuum of power, of purpose, of economic stability. The dream of the antebellum aristocracy had been reduced to scorched earth and unpaid debts. But out of that void, a new kind of economy began to take shape. It would not be elegant. It would not be equal. It would be built on long hours, low wages, and the desperate hope of survival. This was the rise of textiles, tobacco, and the grinding, dusty promise of the New South. Cotton still grew, but it no longer ruled from the coast. The low-country plantations, once the heart of South Carolina's economy, had declined in the face of war, emancipation, and soil exhaustion. In their place, attention turned to the Piedmont, the rolling hills of the upstate, where smaller farms dotted the land and cotton fields stretched across the red clay. There, new forces were taking root. Railroads expanded through the region, linking towns and opening up new markets. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity not in exporting raw cotton, but in transforming it, right there at home, into thread, cloth, and profit. And so came the mill. Textile mills began appearing near rivers, where water could power the looms and spindles. Towns like Greenville, Spartanburg, and Anderson evolved from sleepy farming communities into industrial hubs. Investors from the north, and increasingly from the south itself, poured money into machinery and factories. The mill village was born, a company-owned cluster of homes, a store, a church, and a school, all orbiting the towering brick structure of the mill itself. For many white families in the Piedmont, especially poor farmers who had struggled since the collapse of the plantation economy, the mill offered something that the land no longer could: a steady wage. Life in the mill towns was hard. Men, women, and children worked 6 days a week, often 12 hours a day, inside hot, noisy, lint-choked rooms. Accidents were common. Wages were low. The company's store, where workers bought food, clothing, and household goods, often charged inflated prices, pulling families into debt. Still, for many, it seemed better than the isolation of the farm or the uncertainty of sharecropping. The rhythm of life shifted to the factory whistle. Whole generations grew up beneath the shadow of the mill, their futures measured in shifts and spools. But the benefits of this industrial boom were limited, and not everyone was welcome. Black South Carolinians, barred from most mill jobs by both racism and policy, were excluded from this new economy almost entirely. The Jim Crow system extended into the factories, just as it did into schools and courthouses. While white families worked the looms, black families continued to toil in the fields, often locked in cycles of poverty through sharecropping and tenant farming. The promise of the New South, like so many before it, was not shared equally. Still, the transformation continued. Textile production surged. By the early 20th century, South Carolina was one of the leading textile producers in the United States. Cotton mills dominated the upstate economy. Their owners wielded immense power, economically, socially, and politically. Some built grand mansions and invested in civic projects. Others used their influence to resist labor reforms and suppress unions. The mill villages, while providing housing and a sense of community, also reinforced control. The company not only owned the homes, it often decided who lived there, who got hired, and who was let go. Alongside the rise of textiles came another crop, tobacco. Though not as dominant in South Carolina as in neighboring North Carolina, tobacco grew in importance, particularly in the PD region around Florence and Darlington. As demand for cigarettes and chewing tobacco soared, South Carolina farmers shifted their fields from cotton to bright-leaf tobacco. Warehouses and auction houses sprung up in tobacco towns. It was a boom, but a narrow one. Like cotton, tobacco prices were vulnerable to weather, pests, and international markets. And like cotton, it did not lift most farmers out of poverty. It simply sustained them, just enough to try again the next season. Beneath the machinery of industry and the rows of tobacco leaves lay a deeper, more persistent reality: poverty. For all the talk of a New South, the vast majority of South Carolinians, black and white, remained poor. Education was underfunded, roads were unpaved. Public health was a secondary concern. Infant mortality was high. Malnutrition was common. The wealth generated by textiles and tobacco flowed upward, pooling in the hands of a few. The rest were left to make do with what they had, their labor fueling an economy that gave little back. Efforts to unionize the mills met fierce resistance. Mill owners feared higher wages and loss of control. Workers who joined strikes were often fired, evicted, and blacklisted. The 1934 textile strike, one of the largest in American history, swept through South Carolina and the rest of the South. Workers walked off the job, demanding better pay and conditions. But the response was swift and brutal. State militias were deployed. Violence broke out. The strike failed. Union organizers were arrested, beaten, or driven out of town. The message was clear: the mills would remain in charge. Meanwhile, the Great Depression hit South Carolina with devastating force. Cotton prices collapsed. Mill owners cut wages or shut down entirely. Tobacco markets shrank. Unemployment soared. Families who had scraped by now found themselves destitute. New Deal programs offered some relief, jobs through the WPA, subsidies for farmers, investment in infrastructure. But the wounds were deep. The dream of industrial prosperity was revealed to be fragile, built on long hours, little pay, and endless labor. Yet even in this grinding reality, a new identity began to form. The upstate towns, once dismissed as rural and backward, now hummed with the energy of working-class life. Music, religion, and storytelling flourished in mill villages. Community events, ball games, and union halls became social centers. A culture was taking root, resilient, proud, and deeply tied to the rhythms of factory whistles and cotton bales. As the 20th century marched forward, new forces would reshape South Carolina once again. War, migration, civil rights, and global economics. But the age of textiles, tobacco, and toil had left its mark. It had built cities where none had existed, created fortunes for a few and hardships for many, and redefined what it meant to be Southern in a world where plantations no longer reigned. The old aristocracy had fallen. In its place stood the mill hand, the tenant farmer, the tobacco picker, the working people of South Carolina, caught in the churn of change, yet carrying forward the grit and endurance that would define the next chapter of the state's story. Chapter 12. South Carolina and the World Wars. When the Great War erupted in Europe in 1914, South Carolina seemed far removed from the trenches of France and the diplomacy of empires. Cotton still grew in the fields, mill whistles still cut through the morning air, and Jim Crow laws still dictated the rules of daily life. But war has a way of reaching across oceans and borders. And when the United States entered World War I in 1917, even the quietest corners of South Carolina began to feel its pull. Almost overnight, the federal government transformed the state into a vital part of the war effort. Vast military training grounds were established to prepare soldiers for combat. Camp Jackson, just outside Columbia, sprang up with astonishing speed, a city of tents and barracks that would eventually become Fort Jackson, the largest U.S. Army training facility in the country. Thousands of young men, most of them Southern and many from rural towns, arrived to learn the art of modern warfare. Some had never been more than a few miles from home. Now they marched in formation, drilled with rifles, and boarded trains bound for Europe. The war brought economic opportunities to a state that had long been scraping by. Federal contracts breathed new life into industries. Textile mills shifted production to make uniforms, blankets, and bandages. Farmers found new markets for cotton and foodstuffs. Railroads carried soldiers, supplies, and payrolls. The war created jobs and boosted wages, if only temporarily. It also deepened South Carolina's connection to the federal government in ways that would last well beyond the armistice. But not all South Carolinians experienced the war the same way. African American men enlisted in large numbers, eager to serve their country despite the discrimination they faced at home. For many, it was a chance to prove loyalty, to claim a sense of manhood and citizenship denied by law and custom. They trained at segregated facilities, wore the uniform with pride, and shipped out under the flag of a nation that still treated them as second-class citizens. Some were assigned to labor units, digging trenches and unloading cargo. Others, like the famed 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, saw combat alongside French troops, fighting bravely in battles where they earned medals but rarely recognition. When they returned home, they were not met with parades or gratitude. Instead, they were met with suspicion, resentment, and violence. Many white Southerners feared that black veterans, having seen the world and risked their lives, would demand the rights they had been long denied. In the years immediately following World War I, lynchings increased. Race riots broke out across the country. In South Carolina, the color line held firm, reinforced by white politicians who warned of uppity veterans and black pride gone too far. The very act of wearing a uniform could invite attack. Still, the war had changed things. African Americans in South Carolina had glimpsed a different kind of world, one where trains crossed borders, where foreign civilians treated them with basic dignity, where the rigid rules of Jim Crow held no sway. That memory would not fade. It lingered in churches, barbershops, and family stories. It became part of the quiet groundwork for the next great struggle, one that would erupt a generation later. When the Second World War came in 1939, South Carolina again watched from the sidelines, at first. But after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's full entry into the conflict, the transformation was even greater than before. The state became a hub of military activity. Fort Jackson expanded rapidly. The Marine Corps built Parris Island into a world-class training center. Navy bases hummed with energy. Airfields appeared across the state, training pilots for the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Entire towns were reshaped by the influx of troops and federal dollars. The war effort brought an industrial surge. Mills ran at full capacity. Shipyards, although smaller than in coastal giants like Norfolk or Charleston, played their part. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles that had once been closed to them: welders, machinists, clerks. Wartime posters encouraged unity and sacrifice. Ration books became household staples. School children collected scrap metal. Everyone, it seemed, had a part to play. For African Americans, the contradictions of war were sharper than ever. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy rang through radios and newspapers. The fight against fascism was cast as a moral crusade. But at home, segregation remained the law of the land. Separate water fountains, buses, schools, and voting booths, or no booths at all. Black South Carolinians again enlisted in the thousands. They served in segregated units, worked in segregated mess halls, and trained in segregated camps. And yet they served. They drove trucks through the deserts of North Africa, built roads in Burma, and flew supply missions across dangerous skies. The Double V campaign emerged during the war, a call for victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. It reflected a growing awareness that the fight was not only overseas. South Carolina's black press carried stories of valor and injustice. Soldiers wrote home about their treatment, their pride, and their frustration. Some veterans came back determined to make change. Others quietly resolved to protect what dignity they had gained. The war had widened the gap between the rhetoric of American democracy and the reality of Southern racism. And that tension was not going away. Economically, the war pulled South Carolina out of the lingering shadows of the Great Depression. Federal spending revitalized cities, built new roads, and laid the groundwork for post-war growth. GI Bills provided education and housing opportunities for returning veterans. Though black veterans often faced discriminatory hurdles in accessing those same benefits. The balance of labor began to shift. Mechanization reduced the need for sharecroppers. Urban migration increased. More South Carolinians moved to Columbia, Charleston, Greenville, and beyond in search of factory work and a better life. But even in prosperity, old hierarchies remained. Political power still rested with the rural white elite. The legislature resisted integration and civil rights reforms. Poll taxes and literacy tests remained in place. The armed forces had begun to change. President Truman would desegregate the military in 1948. But South Carolina clung to its past with a grip hardened by history. Still, the momentum of change had begun. The wars had opened South Carolina to the wider world. They had brought new people, new ideas, and new ambitions. The state was no longer as isolated as it once had been. Its soldiers had seen Europe and Asia. Its cities had tasted federal investment. Its black citizens had marched, served, and sacrificed. And they were no longer content with silence. The world wars had reshaped the map of the globe. They had toppled empires and exposed ideologies. But in South Carolina, their most lasting legacy was more subtle, a shift in what was possible. The economy was no longer bound to cotton. The people were no longer bound to the land. The idea that things might one day change, truly change, was no longer a fantasy. And so, in the wake of victory overseas, South Carolina returned to a peace still burdened by inequality, but infused with possibility. The state had helped win the wars, but now it would face a battle of its own. A battle for civil rights, for justice, and for the soul of the New South. Chapter 13. Civil Rights and Resistance. The battles of World War II had ended on foreign soil, but a new war, quieter, longer, and in many ways more difficult, was just beginning at home. In South Carolina, the post-war years brought a rising current of tension that could no longer be ignored. Black veterans returned from Europe with medals on their chests and a sharper sense of what freedom truly meant. The hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while being denied it at home became impossible to justify. The slow, steady march toward civil rights had begun, and South Carolina stood both as a barrier and a battlefield. The state's political establishment resisted from the beginning. No figure symbolized that resistance more than Strom Thurmond. A former judge and World War II veteran, Thurmond catapulted to national fame in 1948 as the presidential candidate for the state's Rights Democratic Party, better known as the Dixiecrats. He ran on a segregationist platform, warning of federal overreach and race-mixing. South Carolina gave him its full support. He carried the state by a landslide, proving how deeply entrenched white resistance to civil rights still was. Thurmond's political star rose even further in the years to come. Elected to the U.S. Senate, he would remain there for nearly 50 years, famously conducting the longest filibuster in Senate history, over 24 hours, to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1957. His legacy was one of polished obstructionism, blending states' rights rhetoric with an unyielding commitment to preserving segregation. But even as men like Thurmond tried to hold the line, cracks began to appear in the system. In 1951, in the small town of Summerton, South Carolina, a group of African-American parents led by the Reverend Joseph A. Delane filed a lawsuit demanding equal educational opportunities for their children. Their children were forced to walk miles to school each day, past white-only schools with buses, libraries, and heating. The case, Briggs versus Elliott, was one of 5 combined into the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. When the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public education was unconstitutional, the ripple hit South Carolina with force. The ruling came from Washington, but the resistance came from Columbia, Charleston, and countless rural school boards across the state. Rather than comply, South Carolina adopted a strategy of delay and defiance. Legislators passed resolutions denouncing the decision. State officials implemented freedom of choice plans designed to maintain the status quo under a new name. Public schools were technically desegregated, but remained practically segregated for years. In some areas, black students who tried to enroll in white schools were met with intimidation, threats, and bureaucratic stonewalling. Integration came slowly, when it came at all. Despite this, the movement grew. Across South Carolina, black churches, community leaders, students, and workers organized to demand change. In Columbia, the NAACP chapter led legal challenges and voter registration drives. In Charleston, longshoremen protested discriminatory labor practices. In Orangeburg, students at South Carolina State College and Claflin College became the frontline soldiers in a grassroots struggle that demanded justice, dignity, and equal protection under the law. Then came February 8, 1968. For days, students in Orangeburg had been protesting the segregation of a local bowling alley. It was a small place, privately owned, but it had come to symbolize the larger injustice they faced every day. Peaceful protests turned tense. Police were called in. And on that night, as students gathered on the campus of South Carolina State, state highway patrolmen opened fire into the crowd. 28 people were shot. 3 young black men, Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, were killed. The tragedy would become known as the Orangeburg Massacre. Unlike the Kent State shootings that would happen 2 years later, the Orangeburg Massacre received little national attention. No officers were convicted. The official narrative cast blame on the students. But in South Carolina, the impact was profound. It revealed the lengths to which the state would go to preserve its racial order. It showed that even unarmed students on a college campus were not safe from the violence of the system they opposed. And it galvanized a new generation of activists who understood that change would not be given. It would have to be taken. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights movement in South Carolina pressed on. School integration moved slowly but steadily. Court rulings forced counties to redraw districts and reassign students. In some areas, white families fled to private academies, creating a new form of educational segregation by class and tuition. In others, brave black students walked into all-white schools under the glare of hostile eyes and the protection of federal marshals. At the same time, black South Carolinians began to gain political ground. Civil rights lawyer Matthew Perry successfully argued cases in courtrooms across the South and became the first black federal judge from South Carolina. Leaders like Majeska Simpkins, Septima Clark, and Cleveland Sellers carried the torch of activism into schools, courtrooms, and city halls. The NAACP grew stronger. Voter registration increased. New black voices began to emerge in local politics. Though progress was slow, it was real. Yet the resistance never fully disappeared. It simply evolved. Racial code words replaced explicit bigotry. Political candidates shifted tactics, but maintained the same priorities. Cutting funding for public services, opposing affirmative action, and supporting voter ID laws that disproportionately affected communities of color. The memory of Jim Crow faded, but its effects remained. In school zoning, in housing inequality, in health disparities, and in the enduring sense that the rules were still different depending on the color of your skin. Even Strom Thurmond, the very embodiment of the old order, changed with the times. By the 1980s, he had switched from Democrat to Republican, welcomed black constituents to his office, and publicly supported programs he had once opposed. He was re-elected again and again. a living symbol of South Carolina's complicated relationship with its past. Only after his death in 2003 did the public learn what many had long suspected: that he had fathered a biracial daughter with a black housemaid during his youth. The contradictions of his life mirrored those of his state. Proud and resistant, evolving and recalcitrant, shaped by history but never fully at peace with it. The civil rights movement in South Carolina was never as explosive as in Mississippi or Alabama, but it was no less important. It was slower, more institutional, and often quieter. But it changed lives. It challenged power, it exposed injustice, and it refused to be silenced. By the close of the 20th century, South Carolina had begun to reckon with its past. Statues still stood, but so did new schools, new leaders, and a generation unwilling to accept the lies of the lost cause. The state had resisted change at nearly every turn, but change had come anyway. Carved by protests, court orders, and the quiet courage of those who simply refused to step aside. The road was long, the struggle was hard, but the resistance met its match, not in violence, but in voices that rose higher than fear and longer than silence, and the fight was not over yet. Chapter 14: The Modern Makeover. As the 20th century drew to a close, South Carolina stood at the edge of profound transformation. It had spent decades resisting change, political, racial, and economic. But now the state began to shift in ways no one could ignore. The old cotton economy was gone. The textile mills that once dominated the Piedmont were fading, and the political machines of segregation had lost their grip. What emerged in their place was something new, a South Carolina that looked outward, attracted global investment, and realigned its politics to fit the evolving identity of a region in motion. It was a makeover decades in the making, and though uneven and often contested, it reshaped the state from its foundation to its skyline. The first cracks in the old order came not from protests, but from party politics. For generations, South Carolina had been the stronghold of the Democratic Party, a party that, in the South, had once meant segregation, states' rights, and resistance to civil rights. These were the Dixiecrats, white Southern Democrats who saw federal power as a threat to their way of life. But after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and the slow dismantling of Jim Crow, the political landscape began to shift. Many white voters felt abandoned by the National Democratic Party's embrace of racial equality and liberal reform. They began looking for a new political home. The Republican Party, once vilified in the South as the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction, seized the opportunity. Through a strategy of cultural messaging, economic appeals, and subtle nods to traditional values, Republicans began to court Southern voters with increasing success. South Carolina was a prime target. In 1964, Barry Goldwater, running on a platform opposing federal civil rights laws, carried the state. In 1976, it remained one of the few states to support Gerald Ford over the Southern-born Jimmy Carter. By the 1980s, the transformation was nearly complete. Ronald Reagan's presidency solidified South Carolina's Republican identity. His message of small government, low taxes, and conservative social values resonated with the state's white voters. The old Dixiecrats became Reagan Republicans, and the Democratic Party was pushed into a defensive posture. Strom Thurmond, the very face of Southern segregation in the mid-20th century, formally switched parties in 1964 and helped lead the Republican realignment. His legacy, complex and divisive, became part of a broader shift that redefined South Carolina politics for a new era. As the political winds changed, so too did the economy. The days of king cotton and mill villages were over. Globalization had gutted the textile industry. Mills closed, jobs disappeared, and entire towns faced economic collapse. But South Carolina, once bound to agriculture and low-wage labor, began to attract new kinds of business. State leaders offered tax incentives, cheap land, and a right-to-work environment that discouraged unions, exactly what many corporations were looking for. Manufacturing returned, but it came in a different form. In the upstate, BMW opened a massive plant near Spartanburg in the early 1990s, marking the beginning of a foreign investment wave that would reshape the region. High-tech automotive parts, precision machinery, and export-ready vehicles became the new products of South Carolina labor. The state was no longer just feeding the nation, it was supplying the world. Charleston, once a quiet port city steeped in history, found new life as well. Its harbor expanded, its downtown revived, and its reputation as a cultural and culinary destination soared. Tourism boomed. The College of Charleston and the Medical University of South Carolina drew students and researchers from across the country. Tech startups began to appear alongside historic homes and cobblestone streets. And then came Boeing. In 2009, Boeing announced it would build a new final assembly and delivery center for its 787 Dreamliner in North Charleston. It was a monumental investment, both financially and symbolically. South Carolina had beaten out Washington State for the contract, thanks in part to its non-union labor force and aggressive incentives. The plant created thousands of jobs, established the state as a key player in aerospace, and signaled that South Carolina was no longer clinging to the past, it was competing for the future. But the makeover was not without tension. The jobs that came were often accompanied by debates over wages, labor rights, and corporate influence. The Republican-dominated legislature continued to prioritize business-friendly policies, sometimes at the expense of workers' protections or environmental regulations. Meanwhile, rural areas still struggled with poverty, poor infrastructure, and limited access to health care. The benefits of the new economy were real, but uneven. Culturally, South Carolina straddled two identities. On one hand, it promoted tradition, history, and Southern charm. On the other, it embraced innovation, industry, and global markets. The tension came to a head repeatedly. In 2015, after the horrific shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston by a white supremacist, the state was forced to confront its symbols. The Confederate battle flag, long flown on State House grounds, became the focus of national outrage. For years, it had stood as a defiant emblem of Southern heritage to some, and a painful reminder of racism to others. After weeks of emotional debate, the flag was removed. It marked a turning point, though not a final resolution. At the ballot box, the state remained reliably red in presidential elections. But urban centers and suburbs began to show signs of political diversification. African American voters, still a powerful bloc, continued to shape local and national outcomes, most notably in the 2020 Democratic primary, when South Carolina voters revived Joe Biden's struggling campaign and helped secure his path to the presidency. It was a reminder that, for all the headlines about Republicans and realignment, the state's political story was still being written. Education, too, became a battleground for the state's future. Investment in charter schools, debates over curriculum, and efforts to close racial achievement gaps all reflected the push and pull between reform and tradition. Colleges expanded, yet rural schools struggled. Opportunities grew in tech and healthcare, but access remained unequal. The modern makeover brought complexity with it. Challenges that could not be solved by slogans or subsidies alone. And yet, the transformation was undeniable. South Carolina had moved from a resistant corner of the Old South to a globally connected player in the 21st century economy. From Dixiecrats to digital startups, from sharecropping to aerospace, from plantation politics to international trade, its journey had been painful, contested, and incomplete. But it had moved. It had changed. The old Palmetto shadow still lingered in many ways, etched into monuments, street names, and memories. But alongside it stood factories humming with machinery, cities glowing with energy, and a population grappling with what kind of state South Carolina wanted to be. The makeover wasn't just about economics or politics. It was about identity, about who belonged, who benefited, and who had the power to shape what came next. The state was no longer frozen in the past. It was leaning, however cautiously, into the future. And the story wasn't over yet. Chapter 15: Tragedy and Resilience. In the long arc of South Carolina's history, tragedy has often walked hand in hand with resistance. From the ruins of war to the fury of storms, from the violence of slavery to the scars of segregation, the state has carried its burdens with a quiet, complex defiance. But in the 21st century, as South Carolina sought to move beyond its past and redefine its place in the national story, it found itself once again confronted by pain so profound it forced a reckoning, not only with loss, but with identity itself. Nowhere was this clearer than in Charleston on a warm summer evening in 2015. On June 17th of that year, inside the historic walls of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, known as Mother Emanuel, 9 African-American worshipers gathered for Bible study. The church was more than a place of prayer. Founded in 1816, it had long been a cornerstone of Charleston's black community, a beacon of resistance and faith through slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and civil rights. Among its members were pastors, elders, and State Senator Clementa Pinckney, a voice for justice and reform. That night, they welcomed a young white man into their circle. They opened their Bibles. They prayed. They offered him fellowship. And then he opened fire. The horror unfolded in minutes. But the impact would last for years. 9 people were murdered in cold blood, killed not only for who they were, but for what they represented. The shooter, radicalized by white supremacist ideology, later said he hoped to start a race war. Instead, the nation watched in stunned silence as Charleston responded with something the gunman had not expected: grace. In the days that followed, grief blanketed the city. But so did unity. Families of the victims stood before cameras and did the unthinkable. They forgave. Not because they had to, not because justice had been done, but because their faith and their community demanded something deeper than hate. The world watched as Charleston wept, prayed, and stood together, even as the pain refused to fade. Still, the shooting exposed something that could no longer be ignored. The symbols of South Carolina's past were still present in its present. Within days, attention turned to the Confederate battle flag that flew on the grounds of the State House in Columbia. For years, it had been a source of controversy, defended by some as heritage, condemned by others as hate. Placed atop the Capitol Dome in 1961 during the Civil War centennial, and in the midst of civil rights protests, it had long served as a statement, a reminder, a refusal. In 2000, it was moved to a flagpole near a Confederate monument on the State House lawn. But even there it remained prominent, defiant, and official. Now, in the shadow of massacre, its presence was unbearable. Protests erupted. Petitions surged. Lawmakers, once reluctant, began to shift. Republican Governor Nikki Haley, who had previously defended the flag's presence, called for its removal. National figures weighed in. The debate, once framed as a matter of Southern pride, was finally being understood as a matter of historical pain. After weeks of emotional speeches, public rallies, and national scrutiny, the South Carolina legislature voted to take it down. On July 10, 2015, under a heavy summer sky, the flag was lowered and removed. It was not erased from history, but it was removed from the seat of government, a gesture long overdue. The moment was powerful, but symbolic. Removing the flag did not erase the history it represented, nor did it undo the structural inequalities that still shaped life across the state. In Charleston and beyond, questions remained. What does it mean to honor the past without being held hostage by it? How can a state built on slavery, secession, and segregation move forward without forgetting? The struggle over identity and memory intensified. Monuments to Confederate generals, segregationist leaders, and long-dead causes continued to occupy prominent spaces in towns and cities. Street names, school names, statues, all became part of a growing national conversation about what is remembered and why. Some called for removal, others for context. Still others demanded that new stories, Black stories, Indigenous stories, immigrant stories, be given equal space in the landscape of public memory. In the years that followed, Charleston continued to grow. Tourists still came for its beauty, its pastel buildings, its cobbled streets, its sun-drenched harbor. But beneath the surface, the city also wrestled with the weight of history. The old Slave Mart Museum drew visitors seeking to understand the city's role in the transatlantic slave trade. The International African American Museum, planned for the site where tens of thousands of enslaved Africans first stepped onto American soil, began construction as a long-awaited monument to truth and reckoning. Elsewhere in the state, a similar complexity unfolded. Greenville and Columbia saw rapid development, with tech companies, cultural festivals, and revitalized downtowns signaling new prosperity. The state welcomed immigrants, investors, and students from around the world. Boeing expanded its operations. BMW remained a global anchor. Universities trained engineers, teachers, artists, and doctors. And yet, poverty persisted. Rural schools struggled. Racial disparities in wealth, health, and incarceration remained stark. South Carolina, for all its resilience, still bore the bruises of inequality. Politically, the state remained conservative, reliably Republican in national elections. But even here, signs of shift emerged. In 2020, the Democratic primary became a pivotal moment in the race for president, with Black South Carolinians lifting Joe Biden from near collapse to national frontrunner. Their votes, their voices, shaped the direction of a national campaign and reminded the country that the South was not a monolith, that South Carolina was not frozen in the past, that it could still surprise. Resilience has always been South Carolina's secret strength. Through war, through loss, through injustice, its people have endured. But resilience is not the same as resolution. The tragedy at Mother Emanuel forced a reckoning, but not an ending. The removal of a flag was an act of healing, but not of justice. The story of the state remains unfinished, its future bound not just to memory, but to action. As the 21st century continues to unfold, South Carolina stands at another crossroads. Its past is undeniable. Its pain, recent and ancient, still echoes. But its people, diverse, determined, and deeply rooted, continue to build. In classrooms, in churches, in protests, and in quiet conversations across kitchen tables, they wrestle with what it means to belong to a place so beautiful, so complicated, so scarred, and so full of potential. Charleston, where tragedy struck, is also where resilience rose. And in that duality of loss and hope, of remembrance and renewal, lies the spirit of South Carolina, a state still healing, a state still reckoning, a state still becoming. Chapter 16. South Carolina Today. Drive through South Carolina today, and you'll see a place that looks like it has outrun its past. Luxury beach resorts line the Atlantic coast, historic cities draw visitors from around the world, and gleaming factories hum in the upstate. The Palmetto State markets itself with charm, warmth, and low taxes, a place where business can thrive, tourists can relax, and college football can bring entire towns to a standstill. And yet, look a little closer, and the past is never far away. It lives in the statues that still stand, the street names that haven't changed, the flags that still fly in front yards, and the unease that sometimes lingers just beneath the hospitality. South Carolina has changed, but it has not forgotten. It is a state defined as much by what it remembers as by what it hopes to become. Tourism is one of South Carolina's great economic engines, and nowhere is that more visible than in Charleston. The city, once synonymous with secession and slavery, has reinvented itself as a jewel of Southern elegance. Tourists come for the cobblestone streets, pastel-colored houses, and legendary low-country cuisine. Carriage rides trot past centuries-old mansions, and waterfront promenades offer sweeping views of a harbor that once bristled with slave ships. Visitors snap photos of iron gates and gas lamps, often unaware of the darker history that gave rise to Charleston's beauty. But in recent years, that story has begun to shift. Museums and historical sites have expanded their narratives. Plantations now offer tours that center enslaved people, not just their enslavers. The International African American Museum, poised on the site of Gadsden's Wharf, where nearly half of all enslaved Africans entered the U.S., serves as both a memorial and an education center. Charleston's beauty still draws crowds, but more and more, it's the full story of that beauty that is being told. Beyond the coast, tourism thrives in places like Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head, where golf courses, resorts, and oceanfront condos offer sun-drenched escapes. Inland, visitors explore historic battlefields, Revolutionary War trails, and the Blue Ridge Mountains. The state's appeal lies in its contrasts: natural beauty and human complexity, leisure and legacy, celebration and contemplation. Politics remains a defining feature of South Carolina's identity. The state is reliably conservative in national elections, often serving as an early bellwether for the Republican Party. It has launched presidential campaigns, saved others, and continues to play an outsized role in national politics despite its size. Figures like Lindsey Graham, Nikki Haley, and Jim Clyburn have shaped conversations far beyond the state line. Clyburn's endorsement of Joe Biden during the 2020 Democratic primary proved pivotal, reminding the country of South Carolina's enduring influence. Yet politics here is more layered than it appears. While the state is often painted in red and blue, local elections can reflect a more complicated picture. Urban areas lean more progressive. Rural counties remain deeply conservative. Racial divides persist in voting patterns, but younger generations are shifting, and political dialogue, once rigid, is now filled with new voices, questions, and challenges. Debates over education, healthcare, economic inequality, and cultural memory continue to reveal the fault lines left by centuries of injustice. Education, in particular, stands at the intersection of progress and struggle. The state's flagship universities, like the University of South Carolina and Clemson, draw tens of thousands of students and produce world-class research. Their campuses are vibrant centers of culture, sports, and intellectual life. But beyond these institutions, many of the state's public schools, especially in rural and majority Black areas, face chronic underfunding, teacher shortages, and achievement gaps. The legacy of segregation and unequal investment still casts a long shadow, even in classrooms built decades after Brown versus Board of Education. Board of Education. If there's one unifying force in the state, though, it might just be football. On Saturdays in the fall, allegiances to Clemson Orange or Carolina Garnet override most divisions. Stadiums swell with noise, and the rituals of tailgating, chants, and rivalry become their own kind of shared language. Football is culture in South Carolina, not just a pastime, but a passion that bridges families and generations. It is a celebration of identity, pride, and community, even as the sport itself becomes embroiled in national conversations about labor, race, and higher education. Culturally, South Carolina continues to evolve. Its food, once overlooked, is now celebrated. Shrimp and grits, boiled peanuts, she-crab soup, and collard greens have found their way from family kitchens to gourmet menus. Chefs draw on Gullah, West African, and Appalachian traditions, blending old flavors with new techniques. Art, music, and literature flourish in pockets around the state. Festivals showcase everything from bluegrass and jazz to indie film and spoken word. Artists are claiming space in communities once forgotten, telling stories long ignored. And still, the tension remains. South Carolina is a state that loves its traditions and struggles with the meaning of those traditions. Confederate memorials still dot the landscape. Debates over history textbooks, school curriculum, and public monuments continue to ignite passionate responses. The state wrestles, publicly and privately, with who it has been and who it wants to be. The past is not just remembered, it is lived. It informs zoning laws, school boundaries, public funding, and private assumptions. At its best, South Carolina embraces this complexity. It teaches it. It acknowledges that the same soil that grew rice and cotton also grew movements for freedom and equality. It holds space for the soldiers and the slaves, for the patriots and the protesters. It understands that its contradictions, its beauty, and its brutality are what make its story uniquely American. Because in the end, South Carolina is a mirror held up to the nation. It reflects both the promise and the peril of American history, the ideals of liberty and justice, the reality of oppression and exclusion, the struggle to reconcile the two. It is a state that seceded first, and one that continues to teach the country what it means to reckon with that choice. Today, South Carolina stands with one foot in its past and one eye on its future. It is a place of contradictions and complexity, of pain and pride, of tradition and transformation. The long shadow of history still stretches across its fields and cities. But under that shadow grows something else, a deep-rooted resilience, a quiet determination, a stubborn hope. It may not move fast, it may not move in a straight line, But it moves, it changes, it endures. And its story of rebellion, resistance, reinvention is far from over.